Speaking of the media, speaking of satire, speaking of the damn thing that we aspire to be, Jon Stewart, ? Meet the Press. This got tons of hype, though I think it was basically just a basic rumor that circled in the mill. I doubt there was any ink put to paper on this, but Jon Stewart reportedly / rumored to have been given the opportunity to host Meet the Press. Thoughts on this idea? Go.
Well, it makes sense, right? I mean, from the standpoint of, Jon Stewart started off with the dream of being Tonight Show's host, right? And he is, a great interviewer. He actually can, in fact, do those interview segments well. So, and he cares about news, so he actually would have done a great job with it, in my opinion. But the problem behind it is then it would have blurred that line between comedic journalism and actual journalism more than it, already has. And from that standpoint, I'm actually glad he didn't do it.
I kind of completely disagree with you.
Okay.
So this
where? How?
I think it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense, and it's a terrible idea. And
well, it's getting our generation out there, right?
But it's not, though, because they wouldn't watch that show. And that's where everything crumbles. People watch a Daily Show because it's funny. If it was 20 minutes of Jon Stewart and a politician, like the last 5 minutes of the Daily Show, nobody watches that show. And why do I know this? Because Bill Maher already has that show. And if you talk to somebody my age about Bill Maher, Jon Stewart, or Colbert / Oliver, who do they know more about? They know more about them. Hold on, let me finish this whole thing. Here's the reason where this really falls apart, though. Let's take a look at Real Time with Bill Maher. You know who doesn't go on that show? Politicians. That's why. Listen, Meet the Press is based on access. You throw Jon Stewart in and that show becomes about, we're going to start sucker punching you. One, it doesn't make sense. I agree with you on the fact that Jon Stewart has a specific point of view. It's not unbiased. That's why it works. John Oliver and all these guys, it bothers me when they call it journalism. It's comedy. It's just good highbrow comedy. But it's comedy. Why? Because they have a direct point of view. Journalism should not. It should be about trying to get to the truth, and it shouldn't necessarily have that. Then you end up in Michael Moore territory where we start arguing about the definition of a documentary. Yeah. So I love Michael Moore films, but they're comedies to me. They're not really documentaries, but they're just solid comedies with truth in them. Now, flipping this back to the Jon Stewart thing, 5 minutes into that, Jon Stewart can't get a guest. The show doesn't exist, and it becomes Bill Maher's show where you get sort of a hive mind mentality happening. It's still a great show to watch. I still really like it, and every once in a while somebody says something and it becomes news. But that show, we talked about this before, Meet the Press, it's about letting those people spout their opinions, and then of course Jon Stewart, which is actually his skill, is takes those clips and shows you how they're full of it. In the actual moment where Jon Stewart has to actually, in a one-on-one, I don't think he does that as well, and you've seen that time and time again. In moments where he can just go and sucker punch people on Crossfire, that's fantastic. But that's a whole other skill to actually sit with somebody and put them on the hot seat in the moment. Jim Cramer ain't Dick Cheney. And so there are these issues where I think Jon Stewart would be great at it, but no one would show up after the first couple of weeks of the show. And I've always said to you, comedians should be in that role. But why it works on The Daily Show is because it's a comedy show that doesn't depend on the access of politicians for the next week for the show to be successful. Political talk shows demand the access to politicians. And Cenk and I had a conversation about this. We played you that clip back a couple months ago. The idea of the Young Turks works and something like this works because we run it down for you. And we don't care if Harry Reid comes on the show.
Access is a huge part of this puzzle. So on TV, they're scared to death of what if we don't have access to the politicians. And I think, so what? The politicians are profoundly boring. They come out with talking points. They're the least interesting guests by a mile, right? So I'm not at all worried about losing access, whether it's the politicians or it's the celebrities or it's the athletes. Right. That's what impedes all of the major TV networks from covering the news in a real way. Now, there are other factors, right? But that's a big part of the equation. And to us at the Young Turks, since we don't care about access, I remember one time somebody from Harry Reid's office told us, you know, you guys are banned because of what you've said about Harry Reid. And I like,
there goes the ratings.
Yeah, and he told me like in a way like that ought to show you, and I thought yes, like nothing better than getting banned by.
I
Harry
must be
Reid,
doing something right.
Exactly, right? And who cares if Harry Reid doesn't come on? Has anybody ever heard Harry Reid? Okay, like so. Anyway, but what that does is on the American scale, it allowed us to do something where we serve the audience first. That's our number one priority. Whereas for the other networks, their priorities are advertisers, corporate parent, politicians who I need access to, and like 18th on the list is audience.
Right.
I forgot about them, right? So we flipped that on its head.
I don't care if John Tory running for mayor comes on this show, because he would just say his talking points. I would nod and say, I don't agree with your talking point, and he would pivot to another talking point. Coma.
Yes.
That's my thought.
No, that makes sense. The access argument actually it makes considerable sense, and the only option to pivot out of that is actually to dilute the entire show and do something that isn't what his target audience is actually looking for. So yeah, so you lose either way.
I still say we got to put way more pressure on our politicians though to go on shows. It's really bizarre to me when a politician who's making our money goes, "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that interview." What? Yeah. Yes, you are, because I'm paying you. That's your supposed like that drives me nuts.
Well, I'm not going to vote for you next time.
Right. But yeah, journalists have to do better and stop being so afraid to lose access, because if everyone did their damn job, they wouldn't have a choice, because everywhere they would go would be equally tough. But unfortunately, the lowest common denominator factor comes into that.
Truth at your convenience.